Hey guys, what's going on? This is the one-year review of my 2019 Husqvarna TX300. So just to start off, much of my opinion has not changed since my first impressions video I made. I'll link that one down below. I'll also link down below the kind of first impressions and review of a friend of mine, Berad, which probably most of you know better than you know me. Now, just to clear up a little confusion that seems to be popping up on Facebook and YouTube comments on some of my videos, this is the 2019 TX300. This one is carbureted. It is not fuel injected or TPI. This still is carbureted. The 2019 TE300s did have a TPI option, but the TX300s did not get that until 2020, in which they are all now TPI. Now that leads me into probably the biggest thing about this bike that I had a problem with, and that is not to say it was a big problem. The stock carb on the 2019 TX300 is a Mikuni carburetor. Now, I know that a lot of people have issues with getting the jetting set properly on this carburetor. I did not have that issue. My issue with that carburetor was it just chugged fuel. I could get barely 30-35 miles of range if I was on it before I was either hitting reserve or just out of gas. Now, everyone I talk to that has had a late year Husqvarna with the Mikuni carburetor, everything from the 150 up to the 300, has said that this has been an issue for them, and the vast majority either go with electron carb or some sort of smart carb, or switch them out for the old Kian carburetors. I have switched mine for the electron carburetor, which I find absolutely phenomenal. I won't go into it because there's plenty of reviews on electron carburetors out there. I will just say that it has worked phenomenally for me on this bike, from low elevation, high temperatures, cold temperatures, and everything in between. It has run without a hiccup. Now, I won't say that it has done anything crazy for the performance of the bike, but it has made things a lot easier, and it has extended the range that I get on a single tank of gas far beyond what I was getting with the stock Mikuni carburetor. One of the other things I mentioned in my first impressions video was that the front brake felt spongy. I mentioned in that video that I thought it might be air in the lines. It's not air in the lines. I ended up talking with a couple other owners and just seeing on the internet that more or less it is the stock brake pads on the bike. Pretty much everybody, they just swap out the front brake pads right away. The problem disappears. I decided to stick it out and see if it ever improved. And it did eventually improve, but it took a good couple hours of ride time on those stock brake pads for it to stop feeling so spongy. Now, I am happy to say that that is pretty much it for the bad things I can say about this bike. Everything else I'm going to say is personal preference. A lot of people were asking me to compare this to the TEs, like changes in suspension and gearing and just overall feel of the bike. So let's get into it. First off, I do not own a TE or XCW or any of the more traditional woods bikes from KTM or Husqvarna. However, I have spent some seat time on a couple of TE300s. I've ridden one TPI XCW and one TE250. Surprisingly, one of the biggest changes I noticed, or differences I noticed between the TE and the TX just from sitting on the bike, was that the TE300 has a much higher bend on the bars. They sweep a lot higher. It's almost like you have a set of bar risers on your bars to begin with. At first, I thought, when I rode the TE250, I thought their bars were significantly swept forward, or that they had were adjusted differently than mine. But upon reviewing it on Husqvarna's website and just looking at pictures and seeing them at the dealership, you can tell that you've got almost an inch and a half, if not more, height on the TE's bend on the bars. Now, that's not terribly significant, but it is something I have noticed that I've never seen someone mention, and I've never noticed until I rode it and kind of compared the two between each other. As for some of the more significant changes, I'll start with the suspension differences between the TE and the TX300. Now, the TX300 has the air forks, the AER forks, the adjustable air pressure forks, and the TE has the traditional spring forks. Now, I don't think you're ever going to be able to get the air forks to feel like the traditional forks unless you do some pretty extensive modification to them. Send them into a suspension place and get them completely redone, revalved, and everything. Maybe even put in a spring cartridge replacement. They are a lot more adjustable, which I appreciate for my style of riding. However, I have noticed that even when I go extremely soft on the front suspension, I still have the occasional issue where I'll get deflected on a log that I feel like I really shouldn't. The wheel should not have deflected off of, or a rock or a root or something of that sort. Now, because I ride such varying terrain, I do ride a lot of Michigan Trail, where I'll have it up to 140, 144 psi, around the stock pressure. It's really great for that because it's high speed. Some of it's whooped out. It's mostly sand. It's not too bad. It's a lot more motocross style riding as far as high speed goes. But then I do like going down south and riding some of the more technical stuff, or going up north to UP and riding some of the more technical stuff. And in that case, it's nice to be able to just air down your forks a bit so that they're a lot softer and they soak up those hits a lot better. If all I was doing was riding the more technical, rocky, hard enduro trials type stuff, yes, at that point I may be more inclined to either get my suspension redone or, maybe go with a TE to begin with. But for what I do, the air forks are just about perfect. As far as the rear suspension goes, on the Husqvarna models, I'm pretty sure they're identical, if not just nearly identical. With the XCs versus the XCWs, you do have the change of the PDS. I have ridden PDS suspension before, and I really have a hard time seeing a difference between the linkage versus PDS suspension. The one thing I will say is you do want a properly sized spring in the rear. I am at the high end of the weight range on the stock spring, and I am considering bumping it up just because I do ride with so much gear that it would make a significant difference. The other major difference between the TE and the TX300 would be the gearing. The TX has what I guess you would refer to as the standard transmission, whereas the TE and like the XCW has the wide ratio transmission. And this means that you have a kind of a lower first gear and a higher sixth gear, I believe. So you can do the higher speed transits and dual sport kind of stuff between, for enduros and such like that. And then the lower gearing you have for the very technical, tight trials type, hard enduro type stuff. A lot of people mention that on the TE, the wide ratio transmissions, you tend to get a bit of a gap between the first and second gear because first gear is so low that it almost feels like there's a spot in between first and second gear where there's not a good gear to be in. You really have to kick it up in order to get to second gear. And first gear just feels too low a lot of times unless you're doing the really, really technical stuff. I haven't really noticed this gap, but I have noticed that I feel like I have to shift a lot more with the wide ratio transmissions, or at least when I'm going kind of a medium speed. We're not really going low speed. We're just going through some slightly wider sandy signal track. That I feel like I have to shift a lot more, or I feel like I'm between gears. It's too fast for second and too slow for third, and I really either have to pick it up or slow down for it to feel like I really have that power. Whereas on the TX300, I really just hardly ever have to shift in most flowy, faster single track. I can really just stick it in a gear, leave it there, clutch it out of corners, pick it up and have plenty of RPMs left to do the faster stuff or to blast my way over some whoops. And that's something that I just haven't felt as comfortable on the TEs. It might just be me, and it might be my specific speed I'm comfortable with that just doesn't quite mesh. But for all but the really slow stuff, I prefer the transmission on the TX. One thing I know people have done with the TX to kind of alleviate the lack of low-speed performance is go up a tooth or two in the rear, and I think this is something I might try this coming season, or maybe even I plan on going down south this winter, and I might try when I do that. Now, to briefly mention the TE250 or just 250s in general, I know a lot of people just prefer the 250s and the faster spinning motors. They just feel more peppy. They feel like you have more instant power. They're not quite as big a tractors as the 300s, and they might not have the linear power of the 300s, but they can feel more fun. I mostly agree with this. I think it's a personal preference. They really have nearly the same amount of power. You can do pretty much everything with either bike. I prefer the 300s just because of the linear power. The power band hit is fun, but the 300s are just more manageable, and it just feels like cheating a lot of the times. It's so easy. You have power there all the time. It's manageable. It's not overwhelming at all, and it's just always on tap. The TE250 that I did ride, I noticed that it feels almost identical to the TX300. I think it's a combination of the lower gearing, plus its valve, the power valve is set in a way that it's fairly linear on its own. So between the lower gearing on the TE and then just the higher power on the 300, they really feel pretty even. In most riding scenarios, the TE, like I said, is going to be better in the slower speed, or it's maybe going to feel more comfortable in the slower speed. But when we were just cruising, they felt nearly identical. It was hard to tell that I swapped bikes. To also briefly mention the TPIs, the only TPI I've ridden was the XEW300 TPI. I've not ridden the new 2020s XCs or TX TPIs, and I have not ridden the TE or XEW250 TPIs that I believe, I'm not sure if they still make, but they did make for a year or two. But my impressions from the one I've ridden and the varied responses from the other people I've ridden with who own them or have ridden them, it seems that they just aren't as consistent. You can really get, a lemon or one that works great. The tunes on them seem to be a one-size-fits-all, and it can really vary from bike to bike a surprising amount. I've had some people say that theirs was really peaky and they didn't adjust the power valve at all, and they seem to have a huge power band hit. I've had others say that they were super, tractor-like and very linear power. And it just seems like they can be so hit or miss and inconsistent that it's something that I'm really concerned about switching to, or I'd be fine with riding one, but I'd be always a little bit afraid that I was going to get the lemon or the bad apple in the bunch that just wasn't up to par or just didn't behave the way I wanted it to, and I wouldn't have a lot of options in order to change it to be more what I wanted, aside from getting a very expensive aftermarket ECU or adjusting the power valve, which I know a lot of people do, but they don't really recommend. That's all I really have to say about it, but I figured it was worth mentioning. Now, with all that said and everything taken into account, if I was to buy any bike today, with the 2020s out, knowing what I do now, if I was to buy any bike, I think I would still buy the 2019 TX300. I think the Electron carburetor is really a superior solution to the TPIs. I think in a couple of years, the TPIs will probably get nice and figured out, and at that point, it would be a much harder choice. But for now, I really like having the carb and not having to worry about the lottery of whether I'm going to get the perfect bike for me or not with the TPIs. I really like the adjustability and the suspension that the TX brings to the table. The air forks, while you can never seem to, I have trouble getting them quite perfect for everything. I can get them very, very close on a lot more things than a standard fork seems to be able to. The gearing is perfect for me. There are little problems like the low speed performance that I might have that I think can be solved with different gearing without substantially affecting the rest of the performance throughout the speeds of the bike. And it's overall the perfect bike for me. I feel like, it might not be for you, and that's why I think it's important that you kind of take everything I say with a grain of salt, and whether the performance gains you might get in certain scenarios with TE are worth it for you. But for me, I really think that the TX300, the 2019 specifically, is just the perfect bike for me, and I could not be happier. Throughout all this, I've really only talked on Husqvarna and KTM. That's not to say that, they're that much better than, the Yamahas, the Betas, the Shercos, the Gas, any of the other two-strokes on the market. It's just those are what I have experience with, and I feel like those really are the cream of the crop. Yamaha, they're fairly outdated at this point. They do make slight modifications from year to year, but for the most part, they're a good bike, but they just don't keep them as modern as a lot of the other brands do. Beta, they do have the counterbalance motors now. I have been hearing good things about them, but when I rode them, I wasn't a huge fan of the suspension, but I did like the feel of the bike. I think that the Betas are a great bike for shorter riders specifically. Sherco, I think, is really coming up. I haven't spent much time on their bikes other than their 4-stroke 300 and their 2-stroke 300 I did get to ride. I think I also did ride their 250, and those are phenomenal bikes as well. I think all of those would be really good options depending on what you're looking for, but I can really only speak on the Husqvarna and KTMs, and I think those really are the best of the best. If you are looking for, the best all-round, no compromises, I think Husqvarna and KTM are the way to go. I think I'm going to end it here. This video turned out way longer than I originally intended it to be. If you have any other questions, put them down in the comments or message me. I'd love to answer whatever I can for you. I hope I covered the majority of what people are looking to know about this bike. I will be doing another video on everything that I've added to this bike, all the aftermarket parts, what I like about them and why I chose them and why I chose to replace the stock parts that I did on the bike. That will be coming in a future video. Just keep an eye out. It may take me a bit to put it up. I've been fairly busy and have a hard time just getting this video out. Thanks for watching. Thanks for making it this far, and I hope I could help.